and thank you for coming to this luncheon and talking to us about floods and droughts.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, both Dana and Susanna, for the introduction. I'm really pleased to be with you. I'm going to try to give an entertaining little introduction to what I do and make it relevant to our local concerns. And to answer Susanna's question, yeah, absolutely. I'm going to talk about what we learned as part of our study funded by the Ohio Water Resource Center, and tell you what I think it means for necessary next steps for what we should do from here. So I'll start out with a sort of an overview, just a big picture about what climate change is. It's always useful to kind of ground ourselves in what is going on. Then I'll bring it to what I think that means for water quality, which is the issue that I think we care most about. Maybe it's a tie between flooding and water quality on the Ohio River in the Cincinnati area. And then I'll tell you about what I'm really excited about, what my grad students are working on here, that I think is going to be an important contribution over the next few years. All credit to really great students. I guess with questions, we're going to do that as a chat thing or something. If you have questions, I guess you can put that in chat, but I can handle interruptions also. If anybody needs to interrupt and ask an urgent question, I'm happy to try to field that. And glad to know you. Really, I feel lucky. I should say I have not been to Ohio State yet. This is ridiculous. I've been in the state of Ohio for 5 years. I grew up in Massachusetts and traveled around a bit. I've been in Ohio for 5 years and I've yet to set foot on the Ohio State campus. So that's a sin that I will try to rectify before too long. I hope I get to meet you all in person. I hope this pandemic allows us to hang out. I love the state of Ohio and I'm thrilled to be here with you. Okay, so what is climate change? On the left, we've got, so this is the information comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They produce really all of the climate information that we have at our disposal. On the left, we're showing that really there's a big increase in global temperature beginning in about 1970. That's like, what is climate change? That is climate change. Climate change is, it's getting warmer. What that means for ocean acidification and glaciers and everything else gets harder. It gets harder the second you start extrapolating the signal to the ramifications of global warming. But climate change means global warming, and global warming means it's already started. I hope you can see my cursor. I'll use it a little bit in this talk. It's been getting warmer since about 1970 all around the world. In the last 100 years, it's already gotten quite a bit warmer. There's no controversy, there's no discomfort about these facts, everybody knows this. What gets tricky is that the projections for the next 100 years are widely disparate. This is the CMIP6 ensemble, so that means it's the 6th generation set of projections from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which they haven't even quite published yet, but they finished the runs and they're writing up the reports, and the reports will come out soon, I think in the next 6 months or so. So this is the best climate information that we have, the projections, and what you want to look at here is that we are in about 2020. And 2020 backwards, there's not a lot of uncertainty, is there? We kind of know what has happened already. We have a sense for it. Looking forward, we could go up here or we could go down here. I'm going to move this thing so I can, that's over my cursor. Okay. We could go way up here to 4 degrees warming in the next 100 years. We could kind of hover around 1 degree warmer in the next 100 years. This uncertainty is what we would call irreducible because it's not scientific uncertainty. It's crystal ball uncertainty. It's are the human beings going to switch 100% away from coal and do renewables and stop driving cars and whatever, or drive electric cars? Are we going to do that, or are we going to not do that? This is, it's not a scientific question, it's a human behavioral question, and we just don't know. And then there's big error bars around, of course, not error bars, but uncertainty bars around the sort of high emission scenario and the low emission scenario. That's scientific uncertainty. That says, well, we're not sure, even if human beings burned a lot more fossil fuel, we're not sure what that would really mean for temperature. There's some scientific uncertainty there, that's fine. But the difference between 4 degrees and 1 degree is a question of human behavior. We're not going to make that go away. We have to live with it, we have to design for it, and that's what I try to do, is decision making under uncertainty. We do our statistical analysis, taking into account that it could be a ton of climate change and it could be a little, And there's just no way for us to know that. So we've got to live with that uncertainty. We have to make peace with it. What effect does this global warming have on the hydrologic cycle? Well, lots of things. I'm a water engineer. I care a lot about the water system in particular, and it has, water has effects on everything, of course, our energy systems, our agricultural systems, everything, right? But let's just sort of limit ourselves to the question of, let's not get into the agriculture or the energy or the, everything else that we could talk about, ecosystems, just bring it down to, let's keep track of buckets of water for a second, the hydrologic cycle, and say, what do we think climate change is doing to the hydrologic cycle? Well, when it gets, again, by climate change, I mean global warming. Increased evaporation and transpiration. Transpiration is evaporation via leaves from plants. And that is often a bigger factor than evaporation, which is just evaporation from open water surfaces. General drying out, higher temperatures speed the hydrologic cycle. You make something warmer, it gets faster, right? This is thermodynamics. So it speeds the hydrologic cycle, which results in shorter rainy seasons, more intense precipitation when it occurs, and longer periods of drought in between, especially in monsoonal sort of situations, maybe Californian, Mediterranean kind of situations, where you have distinct dry seasons and distinct wet seasons. The seasonality shift will be super important in the next 50 or 100 years. In Cincinnati, we don't have so much wet and dry seasons, a little bit, but we have pretty similar precipitation all the way throughout the year. And then storage problems. So to manage our seasonality, we really rely on snow and glacier. And as we're losing those with climate change, that will affect our seasonality of flow. Here's an image from the EPA website of a general drying out, soil moisture trends throughout the United States, with a general drying out in the middle of the country where we produce a whole lot of food. So this is a big challenge. And of course, we've got the Ogallala Aquifer that's under Oklahoma and Texas that is also drying out. It's a different question than soil moisture, but that's saying that our ability to solve this problem by just pumping more out of groundwater is let's say, challenged. It's reducing. Our resilience to climate change is reducing because we're pumping the resilience box, the resilience bucket, the groundwater. And the same would be true in California, where when soil moisture is drying, we just pump more groundwater, right? No problem, except of course, groundwater is a depletable resource. Okay, so that's the general drying out. And then what's happening with extreme precipitation? I said that global warming would make floods and droughts worse, right? And here's a slide credit from my friend Scott at Cornell, who taught me about the, what's it called? Clausius-Clapeyron scaling, which says basically the warmer the atmosphere is, the more moisture it can hold. And so what you would expect to see if the black line here is historical frequency of low versus high events, we have fewer precipitation events that are small and a larger tail of heavy precipitation events. And these are things we are observing already. So this is observed heavy precipitation increase confirms theory and early models and theory being Clausius-Clapeyron and other things. And so we're seeing this. This is a wonderful guy named Nutti and his partner Fischer, Switzerland, I think. And they're observing this in Europe and the United States already. And this paper is a little bit old already. It's 2016. So we know that this is happening. This is not a highly uncertain thing for the future. How much it will happen in the future is uncertain, but it's not uncertain whether it happens or not. Okay, so then climate change affecting not just extreme precipitation and drying up, but climate change affecting the very climate drivers that influence climate all over the world. That would be ENSO, right? El Nino, La Nina, and then all the other ocean dynamics that respond, the Indian dipole, the Atlantic Medonal oscillation, all these things, meridional, anyway, the AMO, the Atlantic oscillation. So all the oceans basically respond to the huge Pacific Ocean. And then as the oceans, let's just talk about the Pacific for a second, and so as it's warming and cooling, that puts water in the atmosphere that gets teleconnected around the world and results in rain or drought all over the place. Heavy influences in some places more than others, but let's say that this is really driving the global climate system. And what happens with global warming? We think that the ENSO sort of oscillatory pattern of a couple of years wet, a couple of years dry, that kind of thing, is likely to increase in frequency as everything gets faster when you speed it up. Everything gets faster when you warm it up. That's the sort of thing that they're projecting for ENSO as well. And maybe that it will get stronger. ENSO, the sort of a temperature anomaly of the Pacific Ocean that might be, 2 degrees is a big ENSO or something. Maybe that's going to get stronger to 2 or 3 degrees of anomaly, which is the ENSO signal that would be a stronger ENSO El Nino or a stronger La Nina. This is something we may have to deal with in our hydrologic systems around the world from oscillatory patterns. Okay, how do we usually cope with this? Well, usually we cope with this by storing what we don't do anything. It happens. We store water in the snow and glaciers. They help us deal with climate variability, which is this speeding up of the hydrologic system. It gets stored in mountains and then it melts in the summer. It's really lovely, right? When it rains in California, for example, it rains really hard in the winter, and it rains on mountains, which turns into snow. And then it comes off those mountains in the dry season, maybe June, July, when you need that base flow in California. It comes at the right time. It's so wonderful. What a wonderful natural system. Well, as you all know, the snowpack on mountains around the world is going down, and glaciers, which are sort of, I'm not sure exactly what a glacier is. This is one of those things I've never quite understood. A glacier, I guess, is snow that's been packed in over thousands of years or something. What is really the difference between snow and glacier? That's a fascinating question. But the snowpack slash densified stuff on the tops of mountains is melting, and we're losing our ability to just deal with seasonality. So in the California case, the rain that falls in the winter now might come right down when there's already too much rain falling in the winter, and you won't get it in the summer when you want it, and you will get it when you don't want it in the winter. This is a big problem, right? This is our ability to manage to store our way out of a seasonality problem is diminishing. Okay, how else do we store our way out of a seasonality problem or an interannual variability problem? We use groundwater, right? But around the world, we've been over extracting groundwater for a long time, and we are losing our ability. So you would see, if I could zoom in here on California, it does not look like the United States has a big over extraction problem, because on average across the whole United States, east of the Rockies, we do not have an over extraction problem. But if you could look at California, or you could look at a couple other places in the United States, you would see a major over extraction problem where we are losing our storage capacity, which is our resilience to climate change, to hydrologic problems resulting from climate change. All right, so that was a crash course introduction to what we are dealing with the problem of climate change in water resources. How is this relevant to our local situation? Climate change and water quality, and by local situation, I mean the Ohio River. Climate change and water quality on the Ohio River. Okay, so the wonderful study by Anna Michalak, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, in Nature in 2016. And she basically said that we have done a decent job of looking into what I just showed you about the problem of climate change on water resources, but have not yet understood, have not yet given any sort of reasonable amount of attention to the question of climate change impact on water quality. So she was making this big clarion call to please study climate change and water quality. We really haven't done that very much. So we're trying to take up her call. So she's saying there has been scant study of how climate will affect the occurrence of extreme events that relate to water quality rather than water quantity. I should bold that. That would be useful, right? Okay. So let's talk about that for a moment. Let's talk about why it's so hard to understand water quality, the water quality impact of climate change. Floods and water quality. We'll do floods and water quality, and we'll do droughts and water quality, right? Floods and water quality. Floods are getting worse. Okay, that's we sort of understand that already. Wonderful study in the New York Times. I think I've had a hard time figuring out where this New York Times study came from. I think it was Stanford University work looking at how many places across the United States are vulnerable to floods. So anyway, this New York Times, I contacted the New York Times author, but got nothing. Oh well, I might contact her again. But study from 2018, reports that there are about 2,500 chemical sites that lie within the water's path. And forgive me, I'm forgetting exactly what the water's path means. That might be a 100-year floodplain, something like that. We build things next to rivers, right? That's the point. We build everything next to rivers. Since thousands of years of human history have evolved, we built things next to rivers. There's 100 good reasons to do that, but we build chemical plants, we build oil refineries, we build manufacturing facility, we build everything right next to rivers. It's really a smart thing to do, isn't it, to build right next to rivers, for how easy it is to get goods up and down the river on barges, how easy it is to get access to good supply of clean water, so many things. So given that we tend to build all of our stuff next to rivers, it begins to be important to understand what gets mobilized, what contaminants. If you flood a chemical facility, Hurricane Harvey in what was that, 2019? Was it 2019? With COVID, all my years, right, are blurring. I think it was 2019. It was 2017. Crap. Oh well. 2017 or 2019. Hurricane Harvey. There are lots of oil refining stuff in Houston. There's lots of oil related stuff in Houston that is heavy chemical refining. When Houston got flooded, those places got flooded. And so it wasn't just Hurricane Harvey flooding neighborhoods with water that ruined people's drywall. It was that the contaminants that got mobilized during Hurricane Harvey aren't gone. They got mobilized and they got put into the groundwater. They got put into I don't know what neighborhood play areas. These contaminants, once mobilized, go in every place that you don't want them to go. So that's what we're interested in. How do floods mobilize contaminants? If you flood a farm that just got pesticides put on it, if you flood whatever, so you get the point. Floods, droughts. What do droughts do? Well, droughts, for starters, concentrate contaminants, right? Droughts increase the concentration of whatever contaminant is in there, because when the water goes down and you've got the same amount of contaminant, then you've got more concentration of your contaminant. But droughts change people's behavior also, right? So droughts might cause farmers to apply more fertilizer or something because they feel like their crops need more help. There's all kinds of things that result when you have a drought. You may rely more heavily on chemicals, fertilizers, or whatever it is to cope. And then, of course, you've got more competition for water. And so people may feel less generous with their use of the water and beat up the water resources a little bit more when they feel desperate to get the water that they feel like they need. Okay, so this is all fine, right? We have a climate change problem, but this is America. This is America. I don't worry about these kinds of things, right? We just build stuff. That's what we do. It's not a big deal. Build our way out of these kinds of problems. We can build water treatment plants. We can build levees. We can, no problem, right? Okay, so let's talk about people that know how to build stuff. The World Economic Forum, Global Risks Landscape 2019, they build stuff. That's what they do. They're economists. They have all the money in the world. They meet at Davos in Switzerland and they talk about building stuff. They build Coca-Cola facilities in India. They build IKEA, whatever manufacturing facilities, wherever IKEA manufactures stuff. These guys, I guess they're probably mostly guys. Unfortunately, maybe we need some gals in there. They understand just how capable we are of just build, throw money at the problem and build our way out of a problem. What I do with my career is risk assessment, right? And basically risk assessment almost always results in these kinds of risk matrices. Here is impact on the y-axis, here is likelihood on the x-axis. And so when you get to the upper right-hand corner, you have both high impact and high likelihood. These are the things that people who build stuff, titans of industry, worry about. And they put them in these color categories, which are wonderful: blue, green, orange. Okay, so blue is economic problems, green is environmental problems, geopolitical problems are orange. Okay, look at the upper right-hand corner. It's all green, isn't it? Isn't that fascinating? The people who build their way out of every kind of problem are most worried about, they have these green environmental concerns in their upper right-hand corner, their highest risk things that they worry about. high likelihood and high impact of damaging the global economy. What they identify are extreme weather events, which we've just been talking about, failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation, natural disasters. There are lots of kinds of natural disasters, but some of them are hydrological, right? So let's just say it's not, people who know how to build their way out of problems don't just think it's easy and obvious to just build our way out of these kinds of problems. Here's another little tidbit. This is from my postdoc advisor, who I love so much, Casey Brown. He was working with Manu Lal. Maybe some of you know the name Manu Lal, super famous, wonderful scholar out of Columbia University. Casey Brown was with Manu Lal at Columbia for about 4 or 5 years before he came to train me at UMass. The size of these bubbles are the wealth of nations. So the wealthiest nations are all clustered in the lower left-hand corner of this figure. What does it mean that the big wealthy bubble nations are clustered in the lower left-hand corner? It means that they have relatively small monthly variability and let's say not too much mean annual rainfall, not too little. They have what we would call a favorable climate. So what does it mean for a nation to become wealthy over the last 150 years? We're talking about Europe, we're talking about the United States and a few other places. It means that they have not been overly challenged by extremely high rainfall variability. These are lucky places, France, America, okay? These are the places that on average, generally, do not have super challenging hydrologic variability problems. It is possible, of course, to be a big bubble up here if you're like Saudi Arabia or Qatar or something. You're a wealthy nation, but you have big hydrology problems. You can maybe govern your way out of that. But what else do these nations do? These nations that have somewhat favorable hydrology. Oh, by the way, sub-Saharan African countries, right, with high rainfall variability would be out here somewhere. They would have, they would just be really, really challenged to develop effectively because all they're dealing with all the time is their crops failing or their houses washing away or some terrible thing, and you can't develop a functional economy if that's the kind of stuff you have to worry about all the time. Well, there's one more thing that we can do, and maybe let's take the example of California, which is not America, but California manages their way out of their, California has really high monthly variability and relatively low mean annual rainfall. What do? They build dams, right? They just build their way out of the problem. They do that because they're in America and they take all the money from New York. They take the money from New York, from Boston, whatever, and then they build their big dams. And great, it was a wonderful investment because now that we built Hatch Hatchie Reservoir and the Oroville Dam and whatever, the Yuba Dam in California, now great, California is paying back New York and Boston in spades. And we're so glad that was a good investment. But that's how we've been solving these problems over the last 100 years. Is that really a way that we can continue solving these problems going forward? So there was this big assessment about the year 2000. There was something called the global, oh no, crap, now I'm forgetting. Oh, the World Commission on Dams, there it is, debating dams. The World Commission on Dams, 20 years on. So this is Oxford University here and Cambridge University, people who really do a wonderful job of thinking about the socio-political, socioeconomic, socio-ecological, all of that effects of just building your way out of problems. And let's just say there is a really big debate about whether we should be building big dams anymore. So with all the challenges I just presented to you about the hydrologic variability we're being faced with by climate change and how wealthy nations have built their way out of hydrologic variability problems and made themselves wealthy, there's real question now about whether we can keep doing this. Can we go to Africa? Can we go to Southeast Asia? And can we just build lots of dams? Is that a useful, productive thing to do? I'm not sure, not sure. Let's just leave it as an open question. I'm happy to chat with you about it later. But these are exactly the kinds of things that I try to evaluate with my models. Okay, so just a little plug for the experience that I have doing this. With that guy, Casey Brown, I just mentioned to you, I wrote this book for the World Bank a few years ago called The Decision Tree Framework, which has become a standard process in the World Bank for evaluating these kinds of questions. The questions are, if we were going to build a piece of water infrastructure, how do we now, if we already have that to begin with, we know we want to build some piece of water infrastructure, how do we sort of stress test it? How do we evaluate the risks that that piece of infrastructure might face under climate change? How do we factor that into our economic rate of return analysis, our cost benefit analysis? So this has become a standard practice at the World Bank and has been taken up by UNESCO in something called CRIDA, the Climate Risk Informed Decision Analysis, by the International Hydropower Association in their Climate Resilience Guide, and the California Department of Water Resources in their Vulnerability Assessment from 2019. So there are ways to do this, but let's say that they're tricky and we have to really think hard about it. I've got some active projects where we are evaluating these very kinds of questions with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, with the World Bank, with UNESCO, in Mexico City, and all kinds of cool places. So there's so much that I'd love to talk about. I would love to chat with you much more about all these cool examples. I'm not going to get into really any of these except the Ohio River right now, but I really do love wrestling with these big questions about whether it is actually a good idea to just build some huge dam, or whether we're going to try something else. And if we're going to try something else, like more infiltration basins or artificial wetlands or nature-based solutions, are those really effective? And how many of them do we need? And all of that really hard stuff, really wonderful stuff. Okay, but let's put a pause on the fact that Patrick has spent most of his career working outside of the United States and take this to a place we actually care about. Let's talk about the Ohio River. Here's the Ohio River. Maybe you've seen that before. You've heard of it. The Ohio River, at a glance, it's the largest flow by volume in America. And I love saying this because everybody has heard of the Mississippi River before, right? They say, what are you talking about? The Mississippi River. And I say, yeah, but my wife is from Minnesota, where the Mississippi starts, right? And it comes down and it connects up with the Missouri River. And that's called the Upper Mississippi. And when the Upper Mississippi comes down to Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and the Ohio River with the Tennessee River link in, guess which one's bigger, guys? The Ohio River is. So why does it keep the name of the Mississippi? I don't know. It sounds like oppression to me. It should be called the Ohio River out through New Orleans, but it's called the Mississippi because of lies. Anyway, that's my recruitment pitch for everybody should come and care about the Ohio River. It's really big. It's a little bit bigger than the Columbia River, just by a little bit, by about 10%. The local water source for about 25 million people, which puts it about on par with the California Department of Water Resources. So again, huge amounts of people, really great significance for our country. It's the direct drinking water source, meaning people with straws in the river, for about 5 million people. It does, something more than $40 billion of goods annually up and down the river in navigation. Let's say 4 or so hundred what do you call them, power plants, and 50 hydropower plants. And the EPA has rated it somewhat recently as the most contaminated surface water body in America. It floods a lot here, famously 1937. 1997 was another really big flood. When I got here, we had March 2015 was a big flood. Flooding is a big issue. And of course, something we're really interested in is when it floods a lot here, what gets mobilized, what washes down the river when it floods. So that's something we'd like to focus on, but let me leave it there with it floods here. Okay, and there's a lot of agencies that are caring for the river. Let's skip that when the Elk River spill happened for a second. Let's just look at the upper part here. There's a lot of agencies looking after this river. God bless them, so glad for them. They need all the help they can get. We've got the National Weather Service, Ohio River Forecast Center. We've got the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Some people don't know that there's an incredibly important office of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers located in Cincinnati in the Federal Building. That's where the Great Lakes are managed. Isn't that amazing? The Great Lakes are managed from, and this biggest river in America that I just told you about, the Ohio River, all managed from Cincinnati. That's a point of pride for our state, a point of pride for our town, Cincinnati. You've got the Coast Guard. You've got this huge EPA office located in Cincinnati. You've got, anyway, on and on. So many federal and local agencies. We've got Orsanco, which is a heroic organization doing the very best they can with not nearly enough money. It's the Ohio River Valley Water Sanitation Commission. It's been functioning for something like 70 years. One of the first river basin authorities in the world, I think, from what I can tell. heroically trying to manage the water quality in this river with very few resources. Then you've got, Pittsburgh water, you've got Louisville water, you've got Greater Cincinnati Waterworks. Everybody trying to keep track of what this river is doing. Okay, no, sorry. When the Elk River spill happened, we're going to tell a story about this Elk River spill. So let me get to that. In Cincinnati, we have about 2 days of water storage capacity, meaning there's something called the Greater Cincinnati Waterworks Richard Miller Water Treatment Plant with a straw in the Ohio River. And when we pull out of the Ohio River, we can stick that water that we pull out of the Ohio River in these holding basins right next to the Ohio River, which I'm actually not sure if they're vulnerable to flooding by the Ohio River. Wouldn't that be ironic? If you treated all this water, you put it in these holding basins and then the river spilled, that would be sad. I have to look into that. That's an interesting question. But we pull it out of the river, we treat it in a really amazing, wonderful water treatment plant, state of the art, and we put it in these holding basins, and then that goes to the city of Cincinnati and across to northern Kentucky. Those holding basins can store about 2 days of water. So if the Ohio, and I'm simplifying this a little bit because we have one other source of water, the Great Miami Aquifer, okay, but let's just say that almost all of our water comes from the Ohio River. If the Ohio River goes down for any reason, right, it's not going to dry up, but if for some reason it's not usable, we can shut off our intake for 2 days and keep supplying Cincinnati and northern Kentucky from those holding basins for 2 days. And then those holding basins are out, and we better turn on our intake again from the Ohio River. So really, big problem. Okay, that's a very small amount of offline storage, smaller than most other places have, but it's again something we can talk about. It's the story of places that rely on rivers. Places that rely on rivers that have historically been just fine, like the Ohio River, can maybe be a little bit complacent about questions of what if the Ohio River, or what if whatever river you're worried about goes down. Let's use this example of the Elk River spill. This is a refinery of sorts. What they do is basically clean coal. So they developed this, Freedom Industries in West Virginia, has this product that washes coal, right, and makes it clean, and that product is pretty nasty. You don't want to drink it. So there was this big spill in January 2014. You Ohioans very likely know about this spill. It was about 10,000 gallons of this MCHM contaminant spill. I can't pull out that very long metho something, whatever. So I can't pull that out of my head. But anyway, MCHM, 10,000 gallons of it spilled. You had 300,000 people without drinking water. You had 9 days when hospital admissions spiked after the ban lifted, the ban on drinking the water from the river. And you had millions who narrowly avoided supply shutoffs. So what does it mean to narrowly avoid supply shutoffs? The plume, the contaminant plume passed Cincinnati in about 2 days. So Cincinnati turned off their intakes. The plume starts going by. They're watching very carefully. The plume kind of ends, the tail of it is ending about 2 days later, and that Cincinnati can turn on. So narrow miss, that's something that we want to explore. So here's our Ohio Water Research Center grant. Thank you so much. It was 2019, about $33,000. The title was Multidimensional Risk Assessment on Riverine Contamination, a case study of Cincinnati, Ohio. Out of that, we're producing a paper called Vulnerability Assessment of Drinking Water Supply Under Climate Uncertainty using a River Contamination Risk Model, a model that is being developed with the funding. So thank you so much. Let me tell you about this model. Here is the Elk River coming out of the Kanawha, or that goes down into the Kanawha River and then goes into the Ohio River and flows to Cincinnati. And here is the computational fluid dynamics mesh that we're developing to keep track of it using shallow water equations, computational fluid dynamics. This is a postdoc that worked with me named Faranak Bazadi, who has since moved on. She's done a wonderful job. And we have this paper that's just about to get accepted in environmental modeling and software. It's in final revision. We're just polishing it up. It should be accepted, I think, in the next couple weeks. Here was our ability to capture the data. So we get these red data points are the plume passing the Meldal Dam, which is about 30 miles upstream of Cincinnati. And then the RMTP is the Richard Miller Treatment Plant in Cincinnati over here. So we have our model is the blue line matching the red data points. And this black dashed line is the existing model that Orsenko had available to them, which is not able, you can see, it does not capture very well the red data points, which is why we had to develop our own tool that could actually capture the red data points. Once we can capture the plume duration, that in order to do risk assessment on this type of spill, what we actually care about is the intake shutdown duration. And so we had to develop a tool that could actually capture plume duration and give meaningful information to decision makers who care about how long they would have to shut down their intake. So the success story on the right side here, this figure, is that the existing tool, again, was not able to reproduce plume duration very well. It was just a very approximate reproduction. It was a one-dimensional contaminant transport model. So Faranek-Behzadi created a two-dimensional contaminant transport model using shallow water equations and that mesh I just showed you, to much more credibly or something skillfully reproduce plume duration, which means we can use this model. Here's a nice animation showing the contaminant moving from Beckford to the Richard Miller Treatment Plant. We can use this model for risk assessment purposes. Now that it accurately reproduces plume duration, we can do a climate change stress test or any kind of stress test using this model, saying, well, under what conditions would the Elk River spill, which again, phew, we made it through the Elk River spill. We didn't have to actually deprive anybody in Cincinnati of water because we shut down our intakes. We pulled from our 2 days of reserves and then we just turned our intake back on. Okay, that was pretty lucky. Under what conditions would that have been worse for us? So let's say, what if the river was going slower? Right? The spill happened in January. What if the spill happened when the river goes fast, right? The river kind of rushes fast in January. What if the same spill happened in October when the river's really slow, or August or something? So we can stress test the types of velocities that result in a slower plume passage and a more desperate emergency situation for Cincinnati. And then we can relate those velocity conditions to actual historical 1914, 1910, 19, these are actual historical years or months when the river velocity was very slow, right? And you would end up with, hey, let's pretend that the Elk River spill happened under flow conditions similar to 1914 when the river was going really slow. These are all Januaries, by the way. Some really slow January or some really fast January 1997, right? That was a famous flood, really fast velocity, okay? So we can look at, just by historical reference, what kinds of historical events that we already have experienced would result in really serious problems for the city of Cincinnati with the same Elk River spill that just occurred. Then we can play games with like, hey, what if the spill was a little longer? The spill lasted, however long it lasted, I can't remember. What if it lasted a little longer? What if they didn't shut it down so fast? All these kinds of stress testing, risk assessment kind of exercises. Then we can play with climate change questions and we can say, what are the conditions that would cause the velocity to go up in the future? Right? And that might be flood, or what are the conditions that might cause velocity to go down in the future? And that might be 1 or 2 degrees of warming that result in, on average, diminished flows. And then you might have an extra dry season that would cause the risks that we had historically for drier Octobers or August or something. Those risks might get worse under climate change when you have extended dry seasonality or you have just generally diminished flows from increased transpiration and evaporation. So these are the kinds of stress tests that we can do to identify conditions that cause problems for this particular historical spill. Kind of interesting. Okay. That's a decent start. We're getting there. We've learned something. We've developed a tool that can help us answer important questions, but we have way more work to do. And so just in the last minute or so here, I'm going to show you something that my PhD student, Rahat Saiful Haq, just presented a couple of days ago. He's looking to defend his PhD next summer, which is very exciting. It'll be my first PhD student. Cheering for Rahat. Go Rahat. But he has some great ideas. He's already got some preliminary results, and he's going to be finishing stuff up in the next few months, I hope. So let me show you where I think this work is going next. One of the so data problems, okay, water quality data problems. We don't have sufficient water quality data to really do, so I'm showing you the Elk River spill, right? Hey, we can really analyze the heck out of that Elk River spill. But wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to just keep talking about the Elk River spill? What if we can really talk about many more water quality concerns than just the one that we happen to have decent data for? Why can't we just do all kinds of water quality questions? Well, largely because the data isn't great. Water quality data isn't great anywhere. I would say on the Ohio River, we have pretty decent water quality data relative to anywhere else in the world, but water quality data are never great almost anywhere. So we have wonderful Orsanko that is doing the very best they can, measuring water quality at these 15 points along the main stem. And they do that every 2 weeks. So we have one data point every 2 weeks at these 15 locations along the Ohio River main stem. So we would say problem number one is we only have 15 points. This is a 1,000-mile river. We only have 15 points where we're measuring water quality consistently. There's some water quality stuff that's measured in places like the Greater Cincinnati Waterworks, the Louisville Waterworks, but that's not a globally available open database, and not really easy to reconcile Louisville's data to Cincinnati's data to whatever. Okay, so we don't have great spatial coverage of water quality problems. We don't have great temporal coverage. So this is Rahat showing that here's this flood that happened 2019, right? We had this 2019 big flood event I was mentioning to you earlier. The river goes up and it comes down. How long does that take? Maybe, 10 days max for the river to go up high and come down. It does that in, let's say, a week to 10 days. But if we have only one water quality measurement every 2 weeks, we would completely miss this flood peak, right? This big flood peak from 2019. We just need better spatial resolution than once every 2 weeks because we will miss big flood events like the one that we had in February 2019. You've got to measure more often than once every 2 weeks. If the question you're trying to answer is how does climate change, which affects floods, then affect water quality, you can't do that measuring once every 2 weeks. We've got to do better than that. So, and then third problem is we have all these pieces of infrastructure that mess up our models. We've got to do a better job incorporating all this infrastructure into our models. That's sort of what Farinac was doing with the computational fluid dynamics model I was showing you before, is improving our ability to actually model contaminant transport. Okay, so what Rahat is trying to do is use remote sensing to fill in the spatial gaps, okay, because we can use MODIS data, for example, that has 250 meter surface reflectance resolution since about the year 2000. Then we can go back to 1980 or so using Landsat, and we can update that all very recently with Sentinel in the last 5 years. So we can fill in the spatial data gaps with remote sensing, and then we can put that into a machine learning model like an LSTM to be able to project, to simulate what the water quality would be in between those every 2 weeks measurements. So there you go, there's MODIS every 250 meters, pretty high spatial resolution. And so some preliminary work fitting MODIS surface reflectance to TSS in the Ohio River gives us a respectable fit. He's still trying to improve it a bit, but our ability to project what TSS is doing in the Ohio River using MODIS surface reflectance, decent. He's got this for every one of those 15 Orsanko stations, and this is his whole Ohio River fit. So we're using that in the LSTM to then be able to simulate every day, because MODIS is every day, what water quality is doing throughout the whole Ohio River. All right, I think that's about it. Here's the LSTM fit and results. These are preliminary. He's getting there. I think we've got pretty good performance. And what you can do from the, okay, last thing you can do from the LSTM, which I think is really cool, is you can extract these weighting factors. This means that you can put all kinds of stuff in a machine learning model, not just the natural hydrology, but you can put in human behavioral stuff, land use stuff, farmer behavior. What are the farmers doing? When are they tilling? When are they fertilizing? All that stuff. You put all of that into this time series input to a machine learning model. And the machine learning model, this LSTM, for example, an example machine learning model, can tell you which ones of these factors have the greatest influence on the water quality response. So it can help you answer a really important question, which is the water quality most vulnerable to a temperature change, for example? Is it most vulnerable to a peak precipitation event? Is it most vulnerable to farmer behavior changes? And once you identify what the vulnerability is using this LSTM machine learning model, then you can simulate changes to that behavior that would put you over a threshold of vulnerability. So it's super cool. We're really excited about it. It's all in development. Hopefully we'll be ready to submit in the next few months. Okay, last thing I'll say here is we're really concentrating on TSS because that's what's easiest to get from MODIS. But total suspended solids is related to all kinds of things, heavy correlations to phosphorus, to all kinds of stuff, heavy metals. So we're hoping that the lessons we learn by concentrating on total suspended solids and turbidity can help us to understand all kinds of other stuff that tends to be attached to that. Okay, and we do our stress test. I'm going to leave off there because I think I've been going too long and say thank you so much. Really honored to be a part of this extended family and looking forward to meeting you in person someday soon. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. So of course I felt in my job telling you that the talk will be about 45 minutes long and then we can ask questions, or you can write them in the chat. I think we don't have a lot of people, so you could unmute if you have any questions and ask. I'll write it in the chat and I will moderate it. And I can.
Hey, I've got a question. All right. So great presentation, Patrick. Thank you very much. One of the things I'm thinking about is the proxy that you're using for contamination. You're like, there are X number of chemical facilities that are within a 100-year floodplain. And I'm wondering, like, is there a way to expand that or kind of hone in on what those risks are in terms of where the contamination is coming from?
Yeah, so wonderful question. And I think that's an active question for us. I'm not totally sure how to do that. I submitted a proposal to NSF a few months ago in which I suggested that we should use lots of spatial principal component analysis on the output of what Rahat is doing. So what my grad student here is doing with trying to, let's say we need something like a 20 to 40 year, depending on whether we use MODIS or go further back than that, database of what the water quality in the Ohio River has been. And then we look at which tributaries contribute most of the water quality problem. And then we look at when are there water quality problem spikes that happen, and where are they happening? And so I think that once we begin to understand where the big water quality changes happen, again, we're concentrating on TSS because we feel like we have to, but Orsenko can help us with a little bit of other data as well. And I think just identifying where the contamination is coming from would help us to home in, I hope I'm getting your question right, on, well, what's there? What is the facility there that's putting the contaminant into the river?
Thank you.
I know you talked a little bit about flow, but it looked like the flow is also very much correlated to total suspended solids and all those water quality parameters. So wouldn't be, instead of using the satellite, can we estimate then the flow rather than the TSS? Like, isn't there more data points on the flow?
Yeah, there's more data points on the flow. That's right. So what we have for flow, which is really helpful, is we have flow in all the tributaries. The Ohio, what is it called? Flood Forecast Center, right? The National Weather Service office over here in Cincinnati has something like 300 forecast points, maybe 700 observation points, 300 forecast points throughout the Ohio River. We can use the flow better than we're using it. Your question about, I think if I'm understanding your question, it's can we really mine that relationship between flow rate and contamination better than we have to make a synthetic time series of contamination without having to see it from the satellites? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think we have to do a better job of that. We have to look more closely at it. And it may be that the flow rate correlation to contamination becomes much more important when we're looking at things that are not just TSS, right? Because what we can see from outer space is these optically active things like color. But if we're wanting to see something that is not optically active, we have a problem. So we may need to just sort of empirically derive what it is based upon the limited observations that we have with flow rate. Yeah, that's a great question.
I have like zillion of them. The other one is, were you involved in I know there was an algal bloom on Ohio River sometime just before the pandemic as well. Were you involved in looking at it and how fast it's moving? It's kind of similar problem, right?
Summer of 2015. Yeah, it was a 600-mile long harmful algal bloom, summer of 2016. I'm very interested in that. And my understanding, it was a little bit before my time. I showed up in Cincinnati in 2017. But my understanding of that event is a fascinating climate change thing. It's that it happened to be a very wet spring in 2015. And that wet spring washed a lot of the farming stuff, the fertilizer stuff into the river. And then, so you had this sort of a lot of baseline fertilizer, nitrate, phosphate stuff in the river. And then it was a really hot, dry summer when the river went way down. And what the Army Corps does when the river goes way down is basically shut those locks, right? Shut the locks and dams. There's like 20 of them. They can turn most of the Ohio River into a lake, basically, and not release any water so they can continue the navigation. So you had this, all this water in the Ohio River in the summer of 2015 that had a lot of nutrients in it that then stagnated for like 2 months under a hot sun. That's a recipe for soup, right? So I think it's a very important question. How often do we expect that to happen in the future? Maybe a lot more often. We better get that under control. We better understand how to manage that. Yeah.
Any other questions?
This is David Rutter. Not so much a question for you as just I put through it in the chat. I don't know if you saw it or not. It was a response to your question about the Greater Cincinnati Waterworks.
I didn't see it. Yeah, but please tell me.
They're about 100 feet above the river, so it would take a very, very
large 100 feet. Okay.
Flood to reach them.
Good. I'm relieved. Thank you.
And I guess very applicable question. Are you working with the MGD, in Cincinnati? Are they aware of your model and how that could affect their intake?
Yeah, in short, they were a partner on the Ohio Water Research Center grant, and I've proposed a couple of projects to NSF with them as a partner that haven't been funded. I've got a couple under review still, so still hoping to get them wrapped in here. But yeah, they're aware. There's a guy named Bruce Witterbury who is really wonderful. Maybe you know him. Really great guy, and I talk to him somewhat regularly about what we're working on here. So they're aware, and yeah, when we write proposals, they tend to be partners on that.
Okay, any other questions, or I think we are running out of time? Maybe one more.
Okay. Patrick, thinking about the, if we're again talking about like 100-year floodplain or 100-year flood, that seems to kind of bring in a problem of just having a limited amount of data that you're dealing with. It's, we don't have a lot of data about what contaminants would be released in a 100-year event because we haven't been like had the machinery or the detection skills or even the problems of detecting stuff that would be released in a 100-year event. I'm just trying to think through like what would be a good way of collecting the data of what type of material would get released in an event like that. I mean, you have existing, sorry, go ahead. You have thoughts.
No, I love it. And Justin, you're the same one that asked the question about how we would spatially analyze where the contaminant is coming from, right? So we're continuing our conversation about that. I love this question. I think, all machine learning, remote sensing, blah, blah, blah. Like somebody's going to go out and say, like, drive around in their car. And at some point, I just have to man up and do this probably. We can make flood maps that are like the 100-year flood map, piece of cake in GIS, right? You make this little flood inundation map and you say if a 100-year flood would happen. And I shouldn't say piece of cake. It's tricky because you have to think about, well, how would the humans respond? How would the Army Corps respond, right? But let's pretend we can make a 100-year flood map, a 500-year flood map. Then you have to look at, well, what's there? What would be mobilized? Yeah, maybe we don't have historical data on what did happen the last time a 100-year flood or a 500-year flood happened in terms of the contamination. But we should be able to know, like that New York Times study, what are the facilities, either the farms, the facilities or whatever that would be flooded under those conditions. And then we have to start thinking about probably qualitatively, not quantitatively, what might be mobilized from those places. I think that's a really important job. I'd love to work with you on it. if you want to help me drive around, I'd love some help doing that.
Maybe EPA, the Breidenbach Center is right there. I mean, they study
Yeah.
Superfund sites and brownfield sites. Maybe they have some
Right.
good data to use.
Yep, great point. Yeah, and this is a lot of the PFAS, PAH sort of concerns. Is just this. These were places that if they were flooded, you would end up with PFAS or PAH or something coming down the river. Yep.
Okay, this is really fascinating. And I could be here forever, but we ran out of time. Thank you so much. I hope once we are over this pandemic bump that we will invite you to Columbus and can meet you on campus as well.
That would be a joy. Thank you. Thanks for including me in this community.
Thank you.